Picture this. A young William James, utterly captivated by a painting. But not just any painting, Delacroix's La Barque de Dante.
Intense, right.
Yeah, Dante is surrounded by all those tormented souls writhing in hell. It's pretty heavy stuff. But it kind of gives us a peek into James's early fascination with, well, the darker side of humanity.
It's interesting, isn't it, how this almost morbid interest kind of foreshadows what we're diving into today. That possible link between creativity and mental illness.
Exactly. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where, you guessed it, we're going to explore that age-old question. Are creativity and mental illness somehow, I don't know, intertwined?
This idea that genius often comes with a price, a psychological price.
Right, some call it the Mad Genius Thesis. And today, our focus is William James, a giant, really, in American philosophy and psychology.
He was a key figure in pragmatism, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And known for making those complex ideas, well, understandable. Oh, and he also experienced his own share of mental struggles.
Which adds another layer to this whole thing, don't you think?
For sure. So for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick, I don't know, rundown of who William James was and why he's relevant to this mad genius idea?
Sure. William James was, well, he was prominent in late 19th and early 20th century American thought. Revolutionized how we see psychology and philosophy, really. But beyond all that intellectual stuff, James's personal life, it was marked by some intense mental suffering, which raises some, well, fascinating questions about the relationship between his inner turmoil and his creative output.
Okay, so brilliant mind, but also struggled with mental health. Got it. But before we jump into his adult life and all his work, let's rewind a bit. What was his childhood like? Anything in his early years that might hint at this mad genius connection?
Well, James's upbringing was anything but conventional. His family moved around constantly, Europe, America, back and forth. So he was exposed to a ton of intellectual and cultural influences, but it also created this, like, rootlessness.
It's like he was always observing, trying to make sense of a world that never really stood still.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have his father, Henry James Sr., brilliant guy, a bit eccentric, a theologian. He encouraged intellectual exploration, sure, but he had strong opinions. He wanted William to be a scientist.
But William, he was drawn to art, huh?
Yeah, real clash there.
That classic parent-child tension, you can almost feel it.
Imagine young William's inner turmoil, right? Pulled between what he loved and what his dad expected. No wonder he later dove into the complexities of the human mind.
And his father even pulled him out of formal schooling, didn't he?
He did. Opted for tutors and travel. While that might sound enriching to some, it's pretty clear that James felt kind of drift, like he lacked structure.
Sounds like a recipe for, well, intellectual curiosity, but also instability. No wonder he was drawn to those darker sides of the human experience, like that Delacroix painting we talked about.
And speaking of darkness, we can't ignore Minnie Temple's death. James was, well, devoted to her.
Her death really set him into a spiral, right? A period of intense introspection.
Totally. Grappling with loss, questioning the meaning of life, purpose, even the nature of reality itself. You know, those big existential questions. And those questions would later become central to his work.
So even in his youth, we're seeing those potential threads of the mad genius emerging. That sensitivity, the existential questions, the unconventional path. But how did this all manifest as he got older?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. See, James's mental health challenges weren't just a phase. They were a recurring theme throughout his life.
And we're not talking everyday stress here.
No, we're talking serious depression and what they called back then nervous breakdowns. These deeply affected him.
Wow. Hard to imagine someone achieving so much while going through all that. What was it like for him?
He talked about feeling overwhelmed by this, like meaninglessness, despair. He questioned his abilities, struggled to find motivation, even thought about suicide sometimes. His letters and journals from these times are, well, raw. They really give us a glimpse into his suffering.
It's amazing he could write about it all so honestly. But I have to ask, did these struggles, did they somehow fuel his intellectual pursuits? Was there a connection between his anguish and his drive to understand the mind?
It's a great question, and one we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into his life and work.
So William James, a lot of mental anguish throughout his life, but he also achieved some incredible things. It's almost like a paradox.
Yeah, it really is. And that's what makes this whole mad genius thing so interesting, right?
Yeah.
Makes us think about those tough questions about creativity, the price of genius, how our inner world and what we achieve are connected.
Right. So we're not just, looking at James's life story. We're trying to see if there are like patterns,
Yeah.
connections between his suffering and those bursts of intellectual energy that led to his work.
Exactly. And to do that, we got to look closer at his work, his intellectual contributions. Let's start with, well, medicine. He actually went into medicine first, but kind of reluctantly.
That's interesting. You'd think with his dad pushing for a science career, he would have been all over it.
Yeah, you'd think so, right. But James, he had his own ideas. But even with medicine, something he wasn't thrilled about, he still approached it with intellectual energy. Remember those notes about leech treatments?
Oh, yeah. Those are something else. Leeches for everything. Mumps. Spinal meningitis. Sounds kind of crazy now.
It does, doesn't it? But those notes, they show us how dedicated James was to understanding medicine, even the stuff from back then. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was critical, skeptical of how limited and dogmatic medicine could be.
So even in medicine, we see him thinking for himself, questioning things.
Absolutely. And that questioning, it led him to be fascinated by alternative therapies and those mind cure movements. He was looking for ways to treat the whole person, not just physical symptoms, which, well, it kind of lines up with how he later emphasized the connection between mind and body.
So he wasn't ditching traditional medicine. He was looking for a more complete approach to health and well-being. And this was all before he really got into psychology and philosophy, right?
Right. His medical training, it showed him how complex the human body is. And that laid the groundwork for his theories on emotion. He'd later challenge the traditional view, suggesting that our bodies react first, then we become aware of the feeling.
So instead of I feel sad, therefore I cry, it's I cry and then my brain says, oh, I must be sad.
Exactly. He flipped the script on how we understand emotions. Pretty radical idea.
Still kind of is, if you think about it.
It is. And this idea, this embodied view of the mind, that the physical and psychological are all mixed up, it became a key part of James's thinking. And it comes directly from his time in medicine.
It's fascinating how different experiences can shape someone's intellectual journey. So we've got medicine. But where did his interest in psychology and philosophy come from?
Well, this is where another important figure comes in. Louis Agassiz, a naturalist, and get this, a big opponent of Darwin's theory of evolution.
Wait, the guy who believed in studying nature through, like, direct observation.
The one and only. James was really into Agassiz's ideas at first, even went on an expedition to the Amazon with him.
Whoa, that's an adventure. In the jungle with a famous scientist.
Oh, it was a big deal for him. Showed him how vast and complex nature is. But it also showed how differently James and Agassiz saw things.
So Agassiz saw a divine plan in nature, a purpose behind it all. But James, he was more drawn to, I don't know, maybe chaos.
Yeah, he liked Darwin's ideas about chance and adaptation, and this difference eventually led to a split between them.
And it's in this intellectual friction that we see James's own perspective forming. He wasn't just accepting what he was told.
He was a pioneer, pushing boundaries, finding his own way, and that way it led him away from the strictness of natural science and towards philosophy and psychology.
But he wasn't alone in this, right? He had like a pretty amazing family and a bunch of brilliant friends who influenced him.
Oh, for sure. His relationship with his younger brother, Henry James, the novelist, that was a big one.
The James brothers. A real intellectual power couple.
Their letters, they show this deep intellectual and emotional bond. They debated literature, philosophy, the meaning of life, always pushing each other.
It's amazing how their unique upbringing fostered that intellectual spark.
And it wasn't just Henry. His friendships with other intellectuals like Charles Sanders Peirce and Chauncey Wright, they were also crucial.
Peirce, he's the logician, right? The one who got James thinking about how language shapes how we understand the world.
That's him.
Yeah.
And right, he was a hardcore Darwinian, a skeptic. He pushed James to base his ideas on real evidence.
So surrounded by all these brilliant minds, always debating, always questioning, it's no wonder James developed such a unique approach to philosophy, what we now call pragmatism.
Exactly. He wasn't interested in those abstract debates that traditional philosophy got stuck in. He wanted a more, well, grounded approach. What are the consequences of our beliefs? How do they affect what we do? Those were the questions that drove him.
And this leads to another important point. James was really engaged with the social and political issues of his time. He wasn't just some philosopher in an ivory tower.
Not at all. He really cared about people. He believed that individuals could make a difference, create a better world. Remember that letter he wrote to his congressman? The one about President Cleveland threatening war?
Oh, yeah. He saw that wave of jingoism and anti-British feeling as a betrayal of America's commitment to peace.
Yeah.
He had to speak out.
Yeah. And that wasn't the only time. He always spoke out against injustice and inequality, immigrants, minorities, workers. For James, philosophy was a tool for social change.
So for him, ideas weren't just, theories. They had real-world impact. That's often overlooked.
Absolutely. He wasn't just talking, he was living his values, trying to make a difference.
And that brings us back to the mad genius idea. How do we see that playing out in James's life, especially his work?
It's subtle, but it's there. Think about how much he wrote and how different it all was. He wasn't content staying in one area. He went from psychology to philosophy to religion, even looked into the paranormal.
So it's like his mind was like constantly searching, exploring, never settling down, almost like he was driven by some inner restlessness.
That's a good way to put it. And those intense periods of depression, those breakdowns we talked about, there's some evidence that they were often followed by these bursts of intellectual energy, almost like a rebound effect.
So the darkness, it fueled a new level of insight.
Yeah, exactly. After one really bad episode, he wrote to his brother. He talked about feeling tough, ravenous for his work in psychology. It's like those times of suffering, they opened something up in him, allowed him to see things differently, make connections that others missed.
And that fits with the mad genius idea, right? That heightened sensitivity, experiencing the world so intensely, both the good and the bad. James, he definitely fits that.
Absolutely. He was deeply empathetic, easily affected by other people's suffering. But he was also really prone to introspection, self-doubt. And you see that sensitivity in his writing. He doesn't shy away from difficult emotions, from the complexities of being human.
You're right. His exploration of grief and loss and the varieties of religious experience, it's so raw and honest, so personal. You really feel like he's not just talking about it, he's lived it.
Exactly. And that's what makes his work so powerful, so relatable. He's not some distant observer. He's struggling with the same questions we all face, trying to understand life's mysteries.
Okay, so there's a connection between his struggles and his creativity. But what about the mad genius thesis specifically? Was James actually, I don't know, mad?
Well, it depends on how you define mad, right? He definitely experienced mental illness. That's clear from what we know. But we have to remember the context, the time he lived in. Back then, mental health wasn't well understood. And the treatments, they were often pretty awful. Asylums, leeches, things we wouldn't even consider today.
So it's tough to say how he would be diagnosed now or what kind of help he might have gotten with modern treatments.
Exactly. What we do know is that he found ways to cope, to channel his struggles into something productive, even transformative. And that's really the core of it, isn't it? The Mad Genius Thesis, it's not about glorifying mental illness. It's about recognizing the potential for resilience.
It's about finding strength in unexpected places.
Yeah.
And challenging how we think about mental health.
Exactly. Acknowledging that brilliant minds can struggle and those struggles don't erase what they contribute.
It's almost like James's life shows us how to embrace our imperfections, to find meaning and purpose, even when things are chaotic and uncertain. And that brings us to another part of the Mad Genius Thesis, that tendency to be unconventional, to think outside the box. James, he definitely embodied that.
Oh, for sure. He was a rebel, always pushing the limits of acceptable thought. From rejecting his father's plans for him to embracing this radical empiricism, he never just followed the crowd. He created his own way of seeing the world.
And that willingness to explore those unorthodox ideas, it's clear in how interested he was in psychical research, which was often dismissed as nonsense back then.
He saw something valuable there in those areas that people ignored, a way to maybe expand how we understand the mind and the universe. He didn't let skepticism stop him from pursuing what he was interested in, even if it meant going into uncharted territory.
So that fearlessness, that's another mad genius trait. It allowed him to make those groundbreaking contributions in so many different areas. And speaking of contributions, let's talk about his work on the psychology of religious experience. That's where he really gets into those big questions, right? The meaning of life, faith, the possibility of something beyond what we can see and touch.
And remember, this wasn't just academic for James. He had struggled with those questions himself, with his own faith, with periods of deep doubt.
Right. And he even had that mystical experience while hiking. We talked about that earlier. It convinced him there was more to reality than we normally see, even if he couldn't really explain it.
That experience, along with his research into mystics and regular people who had these profound spiritual experiences, it all formed the basis for his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's a fascinating read, really. He approaches religion from a psychological perspective, not a theological one. He's not trying to prove or disprove God. He's trying to understand how religious belief works in our minds, how it affects us.
So he's looking at all these different experiences, from visions to quiet moments of transcendence. And he's trying to find what they have in common. It's like he's creating a map of the human spirit.
That's a great way to put it. And one of his key insights is that these experiences, they can be transformative. They can change how someone sees the world, their values, how they act. For James, religious experiences, they were psychological events with real-world effects. They could lead to changes in personality, more altruism, a sense of purpose that could spread outward.
So even if you're skeptical, you can still learn from these experiences,
Yeah.
from understanding how belief shapes us.
Exactly. And James doesn't ignore the negative side of religion either. He knows it can lead to fanaticism, dogma, even violence. But he sees those as distortions of something fundamental in us, that yearning for connection, for meaning, for something beyond just everyday life.
And that brings us back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Was James's interest in these hard-to-explain states of consciousness connected to his own struggles?
It's easy to think that, but it's probably more complicated than that. What's clear is that his experiences with depression, anxiety, and those moments of mystical insight, they gave him a different perspective on being human. He was attuned to how fragile and complex our inner lives are.
So his struggles, they kind of opened the door for him, allowed him to see the world in a new way, to empathize with people whose experiences don't fit the norm.
Exactly. And that empathy is what makes his work so timeless. He's not afraid to ask those big questions, to wrestle with the mysteries of consciousness, faith, the meaning of life.
So as we wrap up here, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
I think the most important thing is that William James's work wasn't just about understanding the mind. It was about embracing the messiness of life. He was fascinated by what he called the depths of the essential dearth. That fundamental incompleteness that makes us search for meaning, connection, something bigger than ourselves.
And he saw this dearth not as a bad thing, but as a source of creative energy, a push for growth, exploration, this relentless pursuit of truth, even if that truth is always changing, always a little bit out of reach.
And this leads to a question for you, our listener. Did this essential dearth drive James's own intellectual and personal journey? Was his work an attempt to grapple with this and find meaning, even though that meaning might always be temporary, always changing?
We really encourage you to check out James's writing for yourself, especially The Varieties of Religious Experience and The Will to Believe. See what you think about his perspective on the human condition. See if you can find your own answers to these profound questions. And remember, James's journey wasn't just about finding answers.
It was about embracing the questions, the uncertainty, that constant struggle to make sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. It was about living a meaningful life, even when you're faced with doubt, suffering, and knowing that, well, our time here is limited.
So what we're saying is embrace that essential dearth. Let it be a source of creativity for you. It's a call to action, an invitation to engage with the world, make it better, even if you never fully understand all its mysteries. That's the true legacy of William James, and it's a legacy that we can all carry on.
And join us next time as we continue exploring the Mad Genius Thesis. We'll be looking at another fascinating figure whose brilliance came from facing incredible challenges. Until then, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.